In our last episode, we explored opening day, Friday, October 1st, at the Florida resort, particularly the problems that came as the Magic Kingdom opened its gates to paying customers for the first time. Attendance was lower than expected by the press, and even lower than the revised figures circulated within the Disney leadership team. By midday, most executives sensed that the operation was in trouble, and by the next day, executives found confirmation that these problems would be serious, particularly in how they played out in the press. And that is where we pick up our story in Part 7. In one local paper, the opening of Disney World was described as, quote, more pop than boom. Nunes recalled that, quote, the 6 o'clock newscasters were saying we'd blown it. Perhaps most damaging was an article in the New York Times under the headline, Disney World opens without expected crush, which described the parks as drawing, quote, only a paper-thin crowd. Jack Lindquist recalled that the chief of the Florida State Troopers believed he had significantly overstaffed patrol officers for the so-called opening. Quote, from everything we heard, said the officer, it doesn't look like this Disney project in the middle of the state is gonna be what we expected it to be. Though none of the on-site managers believed that 30 or 50,000 would descend upon the Magic Kingdom during its first day, they generally believed that the number would be significantly higher than 8,000 paying guests, or 10,000 if you counted the visitors comped in through the gates. Among the executives, the only person who believed that the newspaper predictions might come true was Roy Disney, perhaps hoping that crowds would quickly validate his decision to push forward with the resort without Walt. Quote, I think Roy really believed that we would have a 100,000 day, Dick Nunes said. Inside management circles, executives knew that the numbers weren't good. Quote, I'm sure Roy got a lot of calls from bankers and things, Nunes explained, with people saying, what's going on? But these calls came in after financial markets closed on Friday, meaning that the low crowd levels couldn't affect the Disney stock price until Monday, leaving Disney with the hope that the public's perception of the resort might improve over the weekend. On Saturday, the resort again opened its gates 2 hours early in case a crowd showed up for its first non-school day. But by midday, anyone could see that the park was mostly empty. Visitors observed, quote, workmen still planting trees, nailing down rooftops, and building attractions. At 12:15, at what should have been the lunchtime rush, the Crystal Palace, one of the park's few sit-down restaurants, was only half full. Jane Pug, one of the hosts, said, quote, it's depressing. I wonder where all the people are. Carl Williamson, who sold ice cream in front of Cinderella Castle, noted that Saturday was even slower than the preview days. Quote, during the sneak previews, we'd empty a freezer full of ice cream in a minute, he said. Today I've been here 3 hours and the freezer is still half full. Attendance was so modest that even when one of the monorail lines broke down for 3 hours, the queue to board the monorail on the other beam backed up by only 15 minutes. Outside of the park, Patrol Sergeant Jim Humphreys again explained that the roads were far emptier than they had anticipated. Quote, we had 139 troopers there to manage traffic, he said, and we didn't need half of them. But there were small bits of good news. Over at the Polynesian, more rooms were finished, and for the first time, its pool was filled with water. Using their newly acquired lifetime pass, the Windsor family came back on Saturday to wander through the park, somewhat relieved to be ignored by the press. Like other Floridians, with the festivities over, they could see with greater clarity the nature of the park. It was a Hollywood fantasy where most of the lands related to popular film genres, the Western area, the exotic jungle, and the street devoted to period dramas. The park also presented the history of Hollywood, Hollywood. On Main Street, the cinema showed 6 short films. Among these films were works by Charlie Chaplin and the Keystone Cops, dating back to the early 1900s. Walt Disney was also in the mix with Steamboat Willie, its first sound Mickey Mouse cartoon released in 1928. By late afternoon, it was clear that the second day would produce attendance numbers only slightly better than its first. The Magic Kingdom took in 11,115 guests. By then, Disney executives needed to put forward a narrative to explain why crowds were so low on opening weekend. Card Walker told one reporter that, quote, about 100,000 area residents had already toured the complex during previews, depleting the local audience. He also said that visitation wouldn't expand until tourists outside of Florida arrived in November, when hopefully the 2 on-property hotels were fully open. The next day, in the middle of the afternoon, Peter Pan's flight finally opened to guests, but other attractions remained closed, including the Circle Vision Theater and Flight to the Moon. Company officials finally admitted that with track work continuing on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, that attraction too might not open for months, perhaps not until the beginning of 1972. Attendance climbed to 14,045 people, which was still beneath expectations. One Disney executive told the reporter under a condition that he remain anonymous that, quote, they'll start to get anxious if it doesn't get up over the 20,000 mark by the end of this month. On Monday, when financial markets reopened, the bad news played out in numbers. Disney stock sank by roughly 9%, largely on news of the Disney World opening. Executives inside the company understood that the sell-off would likely continue, further lowering stock price until the company could demonstrate that the resort had the potential to be a success. The Monday attendance figures were no help at all. With opening weekend over, the park was truly empty, with only 6,902 guests. The park on that day was a ghost town. After Monday, Charlie Ridgway announced that the Disney attendance figures wouldn't be released, quote, until there's something significant about the day, like Christmas. Or to put it more bluntly, Disney wouldn't release attendance figures again until they improved significantly. On Wall Street, over the previous 6 months, multiple analysts had valued the company on projections that Disney World would receive 8 to 10 million visitors during its first year. To reach the low end of this figure, 8 million, the Magic Kingdom would need to welcome an average of nearly 22,000 visitors per day. To reach 10 million, an average of over 27,000 per day. On opening day, it didn't even receive half of the low-end estimate. 3 days after the park opened, Baker Weeks & Company, an institutional brokerage, issued a sell recommendation for Disney after reviewing attendance patterns that they deemed, quote, a disappointment. Attendance, another reporter pointed out, was significantly below Disney's earlier estimate of, quote, 20,000 to 30,000 or more per day. In Florida, Disney executives could do nothing about the problems, other than watch as the company was devalued and feel a rising sense of anxiety bristle up around them. Quote, Wall Street said Disney had finally done it. They failed, Nunes admitted. Our stock was down 9 points. And by the end of the day, the stock was down slightly more than that, nearly 9.5 points. On the New York Exchange, trading of Disney stock was unusually heavy, with nearly 100,000 shares trading hands, making it, in terms of dollar value, the most traded stock of the day. When markets finally closed, the stock was down $10 per share, ending at $99.50, even though the overall stock market was rising. In the papers, the bad news, or at least the perception of bad news, continued as the week progressed, with reporters noting that attendance during weekdays was significantly lower than on the previous weekend. Quote, a relatively light crowd showed up at Walt Disney World today, one reporter observed. Outside of the theme park, Disney was again concerned about the 2 hotels. Though they now believed that a reasonable number of rooms at both the Polynesian and the Contemporary would be ready for guests in November, they understood that to complete those rooms, construction teams would need to leave conference and banquet areas unfinished until later in the year. Because of this, Disney called convention groups who had reserved space in November and December with the hope of rebooking them sometime after February 1972. Outside of the hotels, the Disney golf facilities remained empty. To manage this problem, Card Walker gave tours to sports columnists, asking them to tell readers that the course was presently open to local residents who would like to play, then adding, quote, "A time may come when the course will be able to accommodate hotel guests only," though clearly that time was nowhere in the near future. Because Disney had stopped booking hotel rooms for October, Disney itself didn't have deep forecast data on visitation for the next 4 weeks. The information they had came largely from the local Innkeepers Association, which tracked hotel trends in the greater Orlando area. The data there wasn't particularly positive, especially as, weeks earlier, hotel owners believed that they might run entirely out of rooms after the resort opened. Quote, "There are still vacancies for the first 2 weeks in October," explained Hugh Snow, president of the association, "and there are some soft spots after that." Everyone hoped that the bookings would improve in November, particularly over Thanksgiving weekend. The person most upset over the low opening numbers was Roy. To complicate matters, as he had been away from Florida, he primarily understood the event through attendance figures, which told a grim story. In response, he summoned a half-dozen Disney executives into a meeting to address the problem. The executive team all sensed coming trouble. They also sensed that, as with the failure of J.B. Allen the previous year, the low attendance numbers might prompt Roy to remove some current executives from the executive team, or possibly even remove them from the Disney organization entirely. Before the meeting, Dick Nunes spent some time strategizing with Jack Lindquist. "This is going to be a tough meeting," Nunes said. "I know," Lindquist replied. "We'll just have to show what we think." The meeting was overseen by the elder Disney, but filled with men who had developed the Florida resort. Among them were Don Tatum, who was being groomed to replace Roy, Card Walker, who was being groomed to replace Walt, Jack Lindquist, who was in charge of advertising, and Dick Nunes, who had led the charge to open the park. The low attendance numbers and the way it was reported in the press were a substantial problem, particularly in terms of stock valuation. Quote, "Roy," Nunes recalled, "was really livid about it." Initially, Card Walker wanted Jack Lindquist to open the meeting, as it was his job to market the resort. The failure as it was viewed among the leadership team was largely one of presentation, as Disney had done little advertising, instead relying on press articles to get the word out. But Nunes, understanding that all of their jobs were on the line, insisted he report first so as to refocus Roy's attention on the future, not the past. "Jack," Nunes said, "this meeting is called You Bet Your Job. I'm opening the meeting." As the meeting began, Nunes explained that the best path forward was to rely on early data about tourist behavior as it related to the resort. In Disneyland, 82% of guests lived within a day's drive of the park, but in Florida, Disney estimated that 80% of guests would come from outside of Florida. What had happened in Florida was straightforward, or at least Nunes believed it was. Disney had undercut its opening day audience through various preview events. To attract a crowd, they would now need to wait for the coming holidays, when those outside of Florida would be more likely to drive there. Roy was now 78 years old, exhausted from shepherding Walt's final dream into reality. He had neither the energy nor likely the time to frame another legacy beyond the Florida resort. Quote, "In that meeting, he was pounding the table," Nunes recalled. Though Roy rarely swore, he let slip words like damn and hell. Quote, I knew he was angry by the tone of his voice, Nunes said. He was not only angry, but he was concerned. It was what I would classify as a concerned angry. He was very concerned. He wanted it so badly to be successful. Nunes waited for the room to grow quiet. Sir, he said, with all due respect, everyone in this room was there at opening day at Disneyland in 1955. It was a total and absolute disaster. A day that Walt's own staff nicknamed Black Sunday. Nunes then tried to explain the reality of the situation as he saw it. Roy, he said, we've had every person in Orlando and their families here to shake the place down in our pre-opening nights. There are no tourists here, sir. From there, Nunes reviewed their original plan focused on a soft opening building toward the holidays. We projected this to be our slowest month, he said, projected Friday to be our slowest day because we didn't want to live through the opening of Disneyland again when we opened on July 17th, so we wanted to shake everything down. He waited for this observation to take hold, then he continued. Despite newspaper projections of high attendance, months ago they'd chosen October as a type of soft opening for the resort, even if they had thought initially that they'd have more than 8,000 or 10,000 guests on their first day. Here's what we're projecting, he said. The day after Thanksgiving, we will have to close ticket sales before noon. Roy considered this, then said, "You call me," meaning that Nunes was to call him when the park was finally filled to capacity. "Yes, sir," Nunes said. After the meeting, Nunes told any managers, quote, who would listen, that we shouldn't worry until after the holidays. I said, if we don't have to close the gates the day after Thanksgiving, then we'll be in big trouble. Though Nunes would later admit that those first days were, quote, not exactly a great opening. When speaking to the press, he did his best to put a positive spin on the issue, claiming that the low attendance was helpful to train new employees. Quote, we're really glad we didn't get bombarded with people, Nunes told one reporter. He explained that when Disneyland opened in 1955, they had had crowds too big to handle. Quote, we didn't want that to happen here, he continued. We didn't advertise much for the Florida opening. We depended on word of mouth. To one paper, he even claimed that you could, quote, describe our Florida opening as Happy Friday. That is, he wanted the press to believe that the Florida opening was superior to the Black Sunday opening of Disneyland, which had been marred by massive overcrowding. Perhaps on a more realistic note, he pointed out that, quote, this first month will be a shakedown period, meaning that park employees, many of them new to the Disney company, would learn to how effectively operate the resort. He also pointed reporters to the end of October, to the park's formal opening ceremonies. Quote, that's the day we're open to the world. By then we'll be ready. Lindquist, too, tried to put a positive spin on the opening numbers by explaining that when the park opened the previous Friday, the numbers were naturally low. Quote, whether it's motion pictures, Disneyland, or Walt Disney World, kids are only available on weekends in October. It's a steady pattern. But this explanation only offered a reason as to why local families in Central Florida weren't visiting the park on weekdays. It did nothing to explain why tourists weren't traveling to the resort or why adults, which comprised the vast majority of Disneyland's attendees, weren't flocking to the park midweek as well. Following the confrontation with Roy, Disney executives coalesced around two new narratives. The first explained that the opening of Disney World had been arranged with no paid advertising. This was mostly true, though Disney had spent significant resources working through public relations to make sure the entire East Coast knew about the resort's opening through newspaper articles and stories on the evening news. Still, this narrative allowed Disney to punt expectations out into October. Quote, when we opened, we were not ready, Nunes admitted, and we had some major problems. The boat that we built was flexing and taking on water, and we couldn't carry passengers. The trams that we bought that could pull 747s couldn't pull a 4-car train loaded underneath the tunnel from the main parking lot to the Magic Kingdom entrance. The only reliable way to transport people from the parking lot to the Magic Kingdom was by monorail, but even there they didn't have enough capacity. Quote, "We were only at 5 cars and 3 trains," Nunes added. Even with very low attendance during peak times, people were still waiting 30 minutes simply to get on a monorail to take them from the ticket booths over to the park. The second narrative focused on the upcoming 90-minute primetime TV special, which would air on October 29th. It would combine musical numbers filmed at the resort with highlights of the grand opening ceremonies staged on the weekend of October 23rd. Nunes hoped that this TV special airing on a Friday night would create, quote, "a super Saturday" in terms of attendance, or if not super, at least better than anything they'd seen so far, something that would pave the way to a very good Thanksgiving. Though film crews had been at the resort for weeks, they began formal rehearsals with celebrities during the week of October 5th. On Monday, comedians Jonathan Winters and Buddy Hackett arrived at the McCoy Jetport. The following day, inside the Magic Kingdom, production crews posted signs for curious guests. Quote, "Today in Walt Disney World, cameramen are filming historical coverage." These same signs also warned that visitors might appear in the TV special. For the most part, filming was confined to Main Street, where Jonathan Winters joked before the cameras. In his off time, hidden behind dark sunglasses, he mixed with the crowd, often unnoticed, and watched shows such as the Diamond Horseshoe Review. Also on Tuesday, actress Julie Andrews arrived at the Jetport, though her segments wouldn't tape until later in the week. For many locals, this was the first time that the Disney resort took on the flavors of a Hollywood enclave. That night, the big rush job was to finish the Sunshine Pavilion in Adventureland for its dedication the following morning as part of Florida Citrus Day. At night, the ground around the pavilion was nothing more than bare dirt, all of which needed to be landscaped and sodded before morning. It was another all-night job for the landscaping crew. Making his second visit to the resort that week, Governor Askew of Florida and over 400 growers attended the local opening for the Sunshine Pavilion. The opening was arranged as an event for food critics in which Disney chefs produced 24 dishes that featured Florida citrus, from orange tarts to crepes ambrosia to asparagus topped with a grapefruit hollandaise sauce. It should have been a lovely semi-formal outdoor affair in which the film culture of Hollywood blended with the citrus culture of Florida, but the optics were somewhat tarnished as construction workers in hard hats ate lunch on the recently sodded open area behind the pavilion. Also on Wednesday, Julie Andrews, dressed in a white pantsuit, began to rehearse musical numbers with 20 backup dancers at the Magic Kingdom. Rehearsals would continue for days, with her performance taped later in the week and the following week. By Thursday, the Polynesian had all 3 of its restaurants finally open, which was important as the hotel was hosting celebrities, press groups, and the leadership team from the Florida Citrus Growers Association. At the park, much to the surprise of locals, Julie Andrews appeared before the castle, reading from giant cue cards. The taping process was slow, repetitive, but for locals who had never before observed TV production, fascinating to watch. At night, for the first time, the new Pyro team launched test segments of their fireworks show from a partially cleared pad next to the park, not far from the lagoon. Among those who marveled at the display were 96 members of the press and food critics team staying at the Polynesian who, still without a TV signal, were delighted to see the show blossom up without warning and without music over the water. Far less delighted were residents of nearby Windermere, most of whom heard the explosions before seeing distant lights in the sky. This, too, for them, was a sign that the world around them was beginning to change. By the next day, word had spread among locals that Disney was filming with Julie Andrews in the park. Guests, many of them in suit jackets and dresses, arrived early to find a television crew on Main Street setting up a shot. Crowds were still small, but a knot of locals gathered at Town Square, most of them intrigued to learn how a national TV special was filmed. The shot was set up with a stand-in for Andrews, as cameras were arranged and light crews positioned. Finally, around noon, dressed in a lavender shirt and jeans, Andrews appeared. She rehearsed her sequence twice, a production number in which she sang When You Wish Upon a Star, and then boarded an omnibus that took her toward the hub. Once rehearsal ended, she walked backstage, only to reappear an hour later, dressed in a white dress and yellow coat, ready to tape the number. From there, as locals watched, and as they were taped as part of an in-park audience, this part of Florida slowly transformed for them. It was no longer a swamp and citrus grove that had been built up into a roadside attraction. It was a piece of glamour connected by a gossamer string to Hollywood, in which international film stars now nestled into this strange and lovely resort that had been built in their state. Dick Nunes, who was there on Main Street to watch the taping, confirmed that this type of entertainment would be a regular part of the new resort. Quote, "It's just another part of the show," he said. The next day, Saturday, October 8th, was a better day for the Magic Kingdom. Disney still didn't release attendance figures, nor did they likely meet minimum expectations. But the numbers were better. Multiple cast members reported that 3 hours before the posted closing time, over 18,000 guests had passed through the turnstiles. The park stayed open 2 additional hours to satisfy guests. Observers generally put attendance at roughly 20,000, but that was only a guess. Despite an upward trend in weekend attendance, Disney's stock continued to decline. The following week, it was down to $95, a nearly 20% drop compared with its mid-September price. For the press, Roy tried to put a positive spin on the situation. Quote, "We have a lot of people," he told one reporter, "and we've spent twice as much as we originally planned." But Roy also acknowledged that the resort was not running as planned. Quote, "We've got a lot of work to do. We'll always have a lot of work to do." Executives, when speaking publicly, now tended to use the lower figure of $8 million as the target goal for the park's first year, rather than the previous target range of $8 to $10 million. They also tried to redirect the attention of reporters to the weekend after the TV special and also to the end of November. With work and with a unified message, executives tried to convince the press not to pass final judgment on the resort during its first month, but it would be impossible to persuade reporters to withhold such opinions much beyond that. The middle weeks of October remained difficult as the leadership team continued to train new cast members, watch as attractions and hotel areas slowly moved toward completion, and hope that crowds actually did improve in November. As Charlie Ridgway recalled, Roy in private told associates, quote, "Unless we have a full house for Thanksgiving weekend, we're in trouble." I'll be back next Sunday to continue our story about the opening of Walt Disney World. And also, over the next couple of weeks, on Bandcamp, I'll post up some extra material for subscribers. In our story about the opening of Disney World, we're getting down to the final couple of episodes, when we can see with clarity how this period of development changed the culture of the company, changed Imagineering, and repositioned park operations. In short, there was one version of the Disney company when Walt and Roy purchased the land in Florida, and there was another version of the Disney company when the resort finally opened. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. If you enjoy these episodes, if you find them a meaningful part of your week, please support us by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, including some new material that I'll post up later this month. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.